does the goddamn line say, Tony?
Please do not use gendered language.
Then what? I'll be arrested, put in airport jail?
Look, you're going completely sideways, man.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
How dare you?
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
I'm Chris Hansen with Dave on NBC.
Jack Marius Tack-Theratrix.
Hi, I'm Spartacus.
Jackson, Sacramento, he, him.
Steven Seagal.
Sex offender guy.
I'm Keith Morris.
This is Muammar Gaddafi.
I'm Rick James, bitch.
Sorting through the lies.
The hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
We cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
And uncovering the centuries-long plan for world domination.
Learning about Cuba, having some food.
Let's talk about Chinese people.
Have you ever been in a Turkish prison?
Swangles from Fort Lauderdale.
I have sent 6 of my Libyan missiles to blow up the Sears hardware department.
Nothing could be more fun than jumping off a cliff with 2 German bisexuals.
Oh, you English are so superior, aren't you?
Thank you, comrade.
And now, Macroaggressions.
That's what assholes call it.
With your host. Buddy, I don't know who you are, but you're about to get chlamydia. Charlie Robinson.
Hey, Whitey, where's your hat?
You want to drop the blame on Charlie and say it's all Charlie's fault.
He was a retard.
I get some goddamn diuretic.
Welcome to Macroaggressions. I'm your host, Charlie Robinson. Thanks for checking us out. If you're watching on Iconic or you are listening wherever podcasts are served, we certainly do appreciate your support. And this show can't happen without the support of our sponsors as well. Scribd, if you are into ebooks, magazines, audiobooks, or even documents, you've got to check out Scribd, $9.99 a month. You can get your first month for free to try it out. And let's face it, we've all got a lot of time on our hands. So check out Scribd and see if there's anything you like there. And the link for Scribd will be in the description box below. And we are also sponsored by CuriosityStream. And I think that I've watched every documentary on Netflix, and probably most of you have too. So check out CuriosityStream. They have unlimited streaming of thousands of shows. You can stream it on your laptop, your television, your phone, or your tablet. It's $2.99 a month. That's 10 cents a day. Give me a break. If you're done watching Tiger King like I am and you want to get onto something else, check out CuriosityStream. The links in the description box below for both of these sponsors directly support our show, and we certainly do appreciate that. Well, our guest is somebody that jumped on my radar in January of 2019 with an article that she did on NewsGuard, and it really angered me. Her writing is amazing. If there was any justice in the world, she would win the Pulitzer Prize for her 4-part series on Jeffrey Epstein that came out this last year. And in fact, I had hoped that we would talk about Jeffrey Epstein, but then the Dark Winter article came out this week, one that you had been teasing for a little while. I read it. It's going to change the way we view this coronavirus epidemic, and I am speaking about Whitney Webb. Whitney, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, all things considered. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, no kidding, all things considered. Well, so what is it about a simulation that was run in 2001 that is so relevant today in 2020?
Okay, so this simulation that I talk about, which the name you already mentioned, it's Dark Winter. This took place in June 2001. It involved a lot of very high-level people, government insiders, former FBI and CIA directors among them. It predicted the initial narrative on who 9/11 and also the anthrax attacks would be blamed on several months later, and also predicted the mode of attack of the anthrax attacks in 2001, among other things, like who those letters would be sent to, the anthrax would be involved, and things of that nature. And when I mentioned who would initially be blamed per this narrative that was first put forth in Dark Winter, it was saying Saddam Hussein of Iraq would be working with terrorist groups in Afghanistan led by Osama bin Laden. Of course, it would come out, even after that narrative was foisted on everyone, that there were no connections between Saddam Hussein and Afghanistan. This was an invented narrative, and we can trace that narrative back to Dark Winter. What's also interesting about Dark Winter is that a lot of the participants involved had obvious foreknowledge of the 2001 anthrax attacks that were later revealed to not have been the work of a foreign-based attacker, as was the initial narrative, but instead a domestic attacker, or attackers rather, because experts that looked at the type of anthrax that was used in the attacks determined that only 3 to 5 people in the entire country were capable of producing that grade of anthrax, and they would have needed at least a year in a fully staffed lab in order to produce it. So, definitely not a sole attacker or a lone wolf attacker, which is the official narrative that the FBI has continued to, stand by, even though, its lead investigator into the anthrax attacks ended up filing a whistleblower lawsuit and saying the whole thing was a hoax and that they pinned it on some guy, even though there was, he said, a mountain of evidence exonerating Bruce Ivins, who was eventually blamed for this, for these attacks. And this is relevant today because a lot of people that were involved in Dark Winter were involved in simulations of a mass global pandemic that took place last year. This includes the Crimson Contagion exercise, which was a series of 4 simulations between 19 federal U.S. federal agencies, 12 states, and a bunch of private sector actors, including several big U.S. health insurance companies, some homeland security software providers, a lot of interesting characters. And that was led and designed by Robert Kadlec, who is currently an assistant secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services. And he was very involved in Dark Winter. Actually, if you look at the Dark Winter exercise, there were these fictional news clips, sort of like these fake corporate news clips that were part of that exercise. He actually appears in one of them. And the name Dark Winter is actually derived from a statement that he made during that exercise, his appearance in that news clip. So he was involved in creating this and actually has a history in the 90s of basically coming up with these apocalyptic anthrax attack scenarios and bioterrorism scenarios, has a very overactive imagination. He was also involved in the government response to the anthrax attacks, i.e. the cover-up, because that was essentially the government responses. I sort of alluded to earlier, even the FBI's lead investigator on this said as much, right? And Event 201 has gotten a lot more scrutiny, and Crimson Contagion has, even though that was only really one exercise, but it was led by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, which is currently led by Thomas Inglesby, who sort of acted as the moderator at Event 201. He was a co-author of Dark Winter, along with Tara O'Toole, who now works for InQtel. But prior to working for InQtel, was the director of that same center, and they were both involved in several other simulations predicting global pandemics that had the end result of calling for global government, not just last year, but also in 2018, and another one in 2005 that was called Atlantic Storm that ultimately resulted, as I sort of already said, in calls for global government, among other things. So this is very relevant now because, of course, a lot of these simulations that happened last year, people have pointed to them saying, oh, it's very eerie that these people knew that seemed to have all these plans in place for when this type of scenario would happen. And lo and behold, just a few months after these took place, we are basically living this scenario and the government is responding in the ways that had sort of been predicted that way. And this Dark Winter very significant because it's the same players that had the foreknowledge of the anthrax attacks, were involved in the cover-up and involved in the simulations that preceded them, and they're the ones involved in these simulations that happened just last year. So that connection makes it, I think, highly significant because they have a history of doing that sort of thing. So if they have a history of doing that and they were involved in doing it now, I think they deserve a lot of scrutiny that they haven't gotten so far. Hopefully they will now, but remains to be seen.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm getting a bit tired of these simulations going live. I don't know whether it's the drills that they're running on 9/11, the 7/7 bombing, where Peter Power comes out and talks about how they were simulating a tube station attack at these 2 stations, and then at the exact moment they were simulating, it actually happened in the same place, the exact same way. You've got the Boston Marathon bombing, where the Boston Globe is tweeting out a couple minutes beforehand, there will be a bomb simulation drill at the finish line. They keep doing it, and there's loudspeakers going off, and then all of a sudden, what do you know? A bomb goes off, and they deem it to be a live exercise drill. I'm getting a bit tired of this, and it seems like, so my question, I want to know, why hasn't Robert Cradlick been dragged down to the police station and beaten with a rubber hose until he confesses to his unusual involvement in both Event 201 and the Dark Winter exercise? This seems like he's 2 for 2, at least, on these simulations going live. What is this? Who does this guy actually work for? I know he's worked for Health and Human Services, but is he a military industrial complex guy? Is he still, does he have connections to them? Because it seems like it's got their fingerprints all over this guy.
Well, really quick, Cadlick wasn't involved in Event 201. That was Thomas Inglesby and the John Hopkins crowd. He was the one that led Crimson Contagion, which I would argue is more significant because he that was about probing the U.S. government response and things like that. And a lot of those problems that were identified then by him, but nothing was done to fix them. And actually, in his capacity and his position in HHS, he actually made really odd decisions that intentionally infected Americans with coronavirus, because when there was this evacuation flight of this cruise ship that was off the coast of Japan, the Diamond Princess, there were infected Americans and uninfected Americans. And originally the plan was to evacuate the infected and the uninfected separately. And that was obviously would make the most sense. And that is what the people that were being evacuated that were uninfected were told. But Robert Cadlick intervened and basically demanded that infected and uninfected fly together on the same flight. And people weren't informed that they had been on the flight with these infected people until after the fact. So they could have spread it all over the place, right? I mean, it's just really absurd. So anyway, he was directly responsible for that. If you're a guy that spent the past several decades warning of these apocalyptic bioweapon scenarios and then simulating an apocalyptic bioweapon scenario, why would you make a decision like that when the thing is actually happening? It's almost like he wanted to make it worse.
Yeah. What a surprise. Huh? We keep seeing these guys that are stepping in to help. And I use that term loosely, and they wind up exacerbating the situations with some of their poor decisions. It seems like,
right.
Yeah. So
people have been writing this off as incompetence, right? They're saying, oh, it's just the U.S. government. They're full of bumbling fools. But when they're simulating for that, and they've been dedicated, decades and decades of studying and planning for a bioweapon scenario that actually happens, and they're bumbling, incompetent fools, I think very naive. And I think in the case with Cadlick, in terms of his background, there's a lot to question that narrative there, particularly the fact that he used to work with the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was very close to Senator Richard Burr, who was recently caught insider trading in relation to coronavirus. Those briefings that were closed to the public also involved Robert Cadlick. At the beginning parts of this pandemic, at least in the United States anyway, Cadlick was very involved with CIA officials in those briefings and working together with them very closely, which isn't really any surprise when you consider that before he was involved with the Senate Intelligence Committee, he was a lobbyist for a DARPA spinoff and also lobbied for NSA contractors. Wow. So he definitely has his hands in a lot of pies. Before that, he was an advisor to Bush for Homeland Security that came on in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and continued to advise and basically write most of the policies related to quote unquote biodefense of the George W. Bush administration, which includes a lot of controversial programs like BioShield, which basically involved giving a bunch of money to big pharmaceutical companies to stockpile vaccines and other things that could be used in the event of a bioweapons attack and things of that nature. So that's really who Robert Cadlick is in a nutshell. Yeah. But he has some other shady connections too. One thing that's really interesting too is that how he publicly remembers the anthrax attacks, which he was involved in covering up. He, even though he'd been, writing all these books and book chapters about these apocalyptic bioweapon scenarios and had predicted in 1999 and then again in 2001 before the attacks, these apocalyptic anthrax attacks on Los Angeles and New York, he claims that when he heard that that someone in the U.S. had been attacked with anthrax, which the first victim was a guy named Robert Stevens, a journalist in Florida, he said his reaction was allegedly, according to himself anyway, "You gotta be shitting me."
Wow.
Okay, so he's like spent like decades planning and imagining events like this, and he just can't believe that it happened to someone. I find that kind of hard to believe, especially considering he had been involved with Dark Winter just a few months prior. I mean, very, very ridiculous that he thinks someone would buy that claim. But I guess a lot of people that are involved in sort of this clique or cabal or whatever you want to call it are very used to a gullible public swallowing their excuses, right? So.
Yeah, maybe he went to the Condoleezza Rice school of pretending that they didn't have information simulating planes flying into the Trade Center. I mean, it sounds like the same sort of fake story where we had no reason to think that this would happen. Oh, you mean except for the simulation? The
failure of imagination excuse.
Failure of imagination excuse. Well, it's interesting. So talk a little bit about Dark Winter. So it was simulating an anthrax attack, and then the anthrax attack...
Not quite. Almost. So it simulated a smallpox attack. But at the end, after it was revealed that the real culprits were Iraq that attacked the U.S. with smallpox through intermediaries, meaning, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, there were threats to send letters to media officials and, attack the American people with anthrax, specifically like in powder form in letters that would be sent to people. And that's what ended up happening.
Right. Okay. So then there was the serial killer handwriting to Tom Daschle, and then these letters went out and they opened them up and they got this anthrax and it was a big deal. But what really, I guess, got buried after the fact was that upon further examination, this anthrax was, like you said, was very specific, and it could only be made by a certain number of people. It obviously wasn't being cooked up in some cave in Afghanistan or in some, facility by Saddam Hussein and any of those stories, of course, we know. But once they dug into it deeper, wasn't there a connection to Fort Detrick?
Yes. Well, that's what the FBI ended up concluding, is that this originated at Fort Detrick, and the two people they tried to pin this on. First was Stephen Hatfill, who was wrongly accused, and they ended up having to pay him like $6 million because they screwed up really bad there. But then they pinned it on Bruce Ivins, who was essentially suicided. I mean, he allegedly committed suicide, even though he was under 24/7 surveillance by the FBI, and they claimed they didn't notice that he went into a coma from a drug overdose, from Tylenol, and all this stuff. And
there's a lot of that going around these days.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about Bruce Ivins, too, it's not just that they had him under surveillance and didn't realize that he was dying, but also there was no suicide note, and they refused to do an autopsy on his body.
That's normal.
So, suicide. I mean, at least Danny Casolaro and like other people that got obviously suicided, they at least made some like fake note, Even like Gary Webb, right? They wouldn't release the suicide note, but there allegedly was one and stuff like that, Yeah. But in Bruce Ivinson's case, they didn't even bother.
Sloppy, lazy. I mean, the FBI is getting lazy. It always seems that with these domestic situations, when you peel them back and you really dig into it, almost in every case, it seems like the FBI has their fingerprints all over it. Whether it's some partially semi-retarded guy that they've talked into cooking up some bomb scenario, or whether it's the original World Trade Center bombing, or whether you've got Oklahoma City. The common denominator here seems to be the FBI. Was the FBI involved in anything related to the anthrax attacks?
Well, so in speaking about Dark Winter first, you sort of brought this up a little bit, so I might as well mention it. The guy that was governor of Oklahoma, he was governor 3 months when the Oklahoma City bombings happened. He was involved in Dark Winter. He was a key participant in that, and so was a former FBI director as well. And then early on in the investigation into the anthrax attacks, a couple odd things happened that I point out in my article. One of them is that the FBI ordered that the University of Iowa destroy its database of the Ames strain of the anthrax, and that is the very strain that was used in the attack. So the destruction of that database made it really impossible to determine where that anthrax had come from. And obviously this is like criminal obstruction of a high level criminal investigation. But they claimed that the reason they had to destroy it so quickly and early on before, testing could take place and all this stuff was to prevent another terrorist from using anthrax against the American people, which is, a quite, it's really difficult to buy that under the circumstances. The other thing that is a huge red flag is that before anthrax, before the first anthrax victim was even diagnosed with anthrax poisoning and even began to show symptoms, the FBI received an anonymous letter from someone who used to work at Fort Detrick, and they claimed that this Egyptian scientist that used to work there, but in 2001 was working for the EPA, was a bioterrorist and hated the U.S. government. And they were like, blame this Muslim guy, essentially. And the person that sent this letter not only had ties to Fort Detrick, because he, in the letter, claimed to have worked there, but also had obvious foreknowledge that there was going to be some sort of bioterrorist attack that was going to be linked to Fort Detrick at some point, and knew that the letters would, the way they were phrased, they said stuff like "Death to America," "Death to Israel," "Allah is great." Obviously, an attempt was made to frame someone who is Muslim for that crime. And of course, this Egyptian scientist was essentially being framed by someone before the attacks took place. And when the investigation began, the FBI had talked to this guy and determined that someone was trying to frame him. But they also said they had no interest in pursuing who sent that letter, even though they had obvious foreknowledge of what was going on. So if you're just like, even if you're, I don't know, like a little kid that reads Nancy Drew or Hardy Boy books, you would look at that letter and be like, that's my first clue. I'm going to follow that lead. And the FBI was like, no, we won't do that. And we'll also destroy the Ames database.
Boy, it's almost like
so it's impossible.
It's almost as if they're trying to cover up something. What
you think?
That's good. So who sent the letter? Was that Lieutenant Colonel Philip Zach that sent that?
Well, that seems to be the case because, as I point out in my article, in the early 90s, there was an internal Army inquiry into missing anthrax samples that occurred in the Fort Detrick lab in the early 90s. And in pursuing that, it was revealed that there were a couple disgruntled researchers who had ended up leaving and that they had been harassing this very Egyptian scientist who was later framed for the attempted to frame for the crime, right? And the Egyptian scientist had gotten all this harassment, like, racist poems and all this stuff about his faith and his ethnicity. And he had taken it to his superiors. And then Philip Zach is one of the people that, when that was brought to management's attention, voluntarily resigned. Even though he, wasn't working at that lab anymore, he was caught on camera entering the lab on illegally, essentially, not under proper authorization. And it was conducting experiments on anthrax and other things. And, as I said, that was at the same time these specimens disappeared from the lab. And then you have someone framing that same scientist that claimed he used to work at Fort Detrick that had obvious foreknowledge of the attacks. And Philip Zach in 2001 had been he says this on his own LinkedIn, by the way. He had been handpicked in early 2001, which is the head of Gilead at that time in early 2001 was Donald Rumsfeld, who later became Secretary of Defense. And he's the guy that announced all those trillions were missing from the Pentagon's budget the day before 9/11, which hit the accounting office, among, other things that Rumsfeld probably knew. But anyway, Zach had been handpicked in early 2001 to lead a new department, a new project management department that also went along with a complete restructure of research and development at the whole company. So that seems kind of like a red flag. I mean, just given, obviously this is circumstantial, but the FBI choosing not to pursue that lead and then that Rumsfeld connection, I think is really odd, and definitely warrants being looked into. But obviously the FBI has no interest in looking into that. As I said, the lead investigator on the Amerithrax investigation, which was like the case file name for it at the FBI, he resigned from the case in 2006 and filed a whistleblower lawsuit and claims that the FBI retaliated against him. The FBI closed their case into the anthrax attacks in 2010, right before independent analyses of their investigation and their scientific analyses that were allegedly the smoking gun that led them to blame Bruce Ivins for the crime could be conducted. And of course, those independent analyses, when they came out a year after the FBI closed the case, revealed that they weren't smoking guns at all. It was just a bunch of nonsense, inconclusive, indefinite science, and that Bruce Ivins was one of 400 likely suspects if the flask that they said was really where the anthrax came from was where it actually came from, because Ivins was one of 400 people with access to that flask. Wow. So
that poor guy. So some people get away and file whistleblower lawsuits, and other people get suicided, it seems like.
Well, I think in Bruce Ivins' case, they knew that the FBI and the Department of Justice knew that their case against him was so flimsy that if it was allowed to go to court, it would just be dismantled. And Bruce Ivins, then the FBI would be, without a suspect X number of so many years after the attacks had taken place. So in order to close the case and pin it on someone, they had to prevent that from going to trial. So I think that was the main motive, because a lot of the people that did this independent scientific analysis, they pointed out, well, the only way we could have ever challenged this in court or officially challenged the FBI's narrative is if this had gone to court and Bruce Ivins had not conveniently died right before it was going to go to court, right?
Wow. So there's another sketchy guy that makes his appearance in your article named Jerome Hauer. Who is this guy?
Man.
This guy seems to have some pretty significant foresight, instructing the Bush administration to start taking Cipro before there was even talk of an anthrax attack, and then it happens. And so who is this? This guy strikes me as being a deep state swamp creature of epic proportions.
Oh, it is epic how deep he is in all of this. So it's almost hard to isolate the deep state parts of Jerome Hauer from other ones. Jerome Hauer today, for example, works for Teneo, which is Doug Band's consultancy firm, and Doug Band, of course, is like the Clinton family bag man. And had close ties to Jeffrey Epstein and was on his plane all the time and stuff like that. Yeah. So that's where Hauer works now. But Jerome Hauer in 2001, he, at the time of the anthrax attacks, he was working for Kroll Inc., which was this, it's been called by some journalists, the CIA of Wall Street. It was accused of actually being a front for the CIA by French intelligence. Anyway, he was doing in charge of security for the World Trade Center complex on 9/11. But of course, on that day, he was not in his office and made media appearances instead. How convenient. And he knew right away, before there was any investigation or anything, that it was Osama bin Laden's fault. Okay. So beyond that, there was a guy named John.
Did he share a cab with L. Paul Bremer to leaving the trade centers and going to the NBC studio? Because it seems like they were both spinning that same story when they should have been at work.
Well, I think Ehud Barak was also conveniently in New York for media appearisses that same day as well, with the same narrative. So it's quite odd, all of that taken together. But beyond that, John, this guy named John O'Neill, who was considered to be the leading expert in Osama bin Laden, died in the attacks, and that's because he was appointed to a position at World Trade Center security that he was given by Jerome Hauer. It was actually Jerome Hauer that convinced him to take that job that eventually led to his death. But Hauer knew not to come to work that day, but O'Neill did not. And of course, O'Neill's expertise in Osama bin Laden was a major obstacle to the official narrative that he was blamed for the attacks. So that's worth pointing out in Jerome Hauer's case. But also at that time, after 9/11, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, not only did Jerome Hauer advise the Bush administration to start taking Cipro to prevent anthrax attacks, he was also an advisor to the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Health and Human Services, which, of course, he helped advise them and helped manage their response to the anthrax attacks that he, of course, on that same day where he, told he became, an advisor those agencies on the same day that he told the Bush administration to start taking Cipro because there might be an anthrax attack, right? So there seems to be a lot of odd things going on with Hauer in that specific period of time. And of course, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, also, he made several media appearances where he sort of teased that there would be an anthrax attack. in weeks before it even emerged. And he wasn't the only one. There were several other, neocons, specifically, PNAC, or Project for a New American Century neocons, that were also talking about an imminent anthrax attack, including Donald Kagan, Richard Pearl, and some other guys. But Jerome Hauer was one of those, right? And of course involved in managing the response. And he also profiteered in a huge way off of the government response to the anthrax attacks that involved mass purchase of the anthrax vaccine. And the company responsible for producing that anthrax vaccine is going to be in part 2 of my series. It's very shady, but he's actually still on its board. And now this same company is behind 2 coronavirus vaccines and an experimental plasma blood treatment that is already doing trials in New York. And was fast-tracked by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who actually used to be Jerome Hauer's boss, because Hauer was brought back on to work for New York State's Office of Emergency Management around the time Hurricane Sandy took place and all of that. So he was working under Cuomo during that period. It's also going back before 2001, the Office of Emergency Management of New York City. Jerome Hauer had been appointed to that post in 1996 by Rudy Giuliani, and it was actually Hauer's decision to put the Office of Emergency Management of New York City in World Trade Center 7, which, of course, was empty as that building collapsed in free fall due to building fires, even though it fell, into its own footprint in 7 seconds from fires. But anyway, Hauer was responsible for the placement of that office there. And just very clearly had a lot of shady stuff going on. But his involvement with this company is very interesting, especially considering the fact that not only did they profiteer off of the anthrax fears and now coronavirus, but in between there, also Ebola, Zika, and the opioid crisis. This company also bought the rights to the only medicine. It's like a nasal spray that first responders can use to respond to an opioid overdose that's going on. And this company owns the only rights to that. And every time a generic competitor or, tried to make a cheaper generic version, this company took them to court and sued the crud out of them because they wanted to profiteer off of, the extreme suffering caused by the opioid crisis, which has killed way more people than coronavirus, by the way. But they actually have an economic incentive for those overdoses to happen because it allows them to sell this product they have sole rights over. And they're a very interesting company. I'll be getting more into them in my part 2. It actually has ties to the Porton Down facility, the bioweapons lab in the UK. The guy that helped privatize parts of that is actually one of the key players in this company as well. So a lot of really odd UK connections are involved in that company as well. It's
that's
very insidious.
With Jerome Hauer, with all his connections to Jules Kroll and all and everyone involved in the 9/11 event. It just leads me to the next question, which is, does this guy have ties to Israel? Because it seems like everybody else in that circle certainly does. Is he by any chance a dual citizen or have some sort of Mossad connections?
Well, I haven't looked into that personally, but I do know that Jerome Hauer does turn up in the work of Christopher Belen, who claims that, who found that his parents, his mother specifically, were very involved in some sort of extreme right-wing Zionist school in New York City. In terms of dual citizenship, I'm not really sure if that's the case. I haven't looked into that, but I do know that in the years since, not only does Jerome Hauer work at Teneo, he's also part of the Chertoff group, which is led by Michael Chertoff, whose mother used to work for Mossad. And of course, he was involved in some things that went on in 9/11. He was at the Department of Justice, helped the quote-unquote dancing Israelis get deported without any charges back to Israel, among other things, and then became head of Homeland Security. So, I mean, there definitely are connections between Chertoff and Hauer. So, I can't really say definitively because I haven't investigated that aspect of Hauer's background, but it seems to be the case. And if he came up in Belen's work, it's most likely there's something there.
Yeah, this looks like we've got a lot of overlap between these 9/11 scumbags and some of the more current things that are going on. I'm wondering if I've done some work on Event 201, and this is a simulation that was run in New York City in October of 2019, simulating the outbreak of a coronavirus. Talk to us a little bit about that, and if you had like a Venn diagram, who would be in the middle of that, overlapping between the Dark Winter scenarios and the Event 201 scenario that we just saw play out?
Okay, so the overlapping part between those two is clearly the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, which has a bunch of different names and subdivisions, but basically the director of that, as I mentioned, is Thomas Inglesby. Before that, it was Tara O'Toole, and the two of them were the main designers of Dark Winter. And they also personally briefed Dick Cheney very close to the day of 9/11 about the Dark Winter exercise and exactly what it entailed, and gave him very specific information about the simulation that later, by all appearances, was used as a basis for those very attacks. Right. So Thomas Inglesby and Tara O'Toole also were involved in the cover-up of the anthrax attacks that they, created the simulation that they predicted, in the sense that they painted themselves as this independent panel of scientists, the two of them, and claimed, really tried to keep together this failed narrative that it was related to Al-Qaeda, the anthrax attacks anyway, and was related to 9/11, even though, as we mentioned already, it was a domestic source. What they tried to say is that in, I think, around the same time Dark Winter happened in like June 2001, one of the alleged 9/11 hijackers went to a doctor in Florida for this weird lesion on his leg. And they claimed, Tara O'Toole and Inglesby claimed that it was the lesion was a result of cutaneous anthrax exposure, meaning like skin exposure to anthrax. And they said, this is proof that the hijackers were handling anthrax before 9/11, and thus there is a link between them and the anthrax attacks. But this took place in like early 2002 when that narrative was already falling apart. So it's a clear effort, in my opinion, at damage control. So the fact that they were trying to do damage control and using like fake science basically to back that up for the simulation and the narrative that simulation put forward that they both designed, I think is very significant. And then we look at them reappear here in Event 201, where Inglesby was the moderator essentially, and this was co-hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center along with Davos, the World Economic Forum, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? So like they're one of the three main organizations that put this on. Obviously, the Bill Gates Foundation, very shady. Obviously, the World Economic Forum, the Davos economic elite of the world, very shady. And then you have the Johns Hopkins Center, which, it's this independent center that's so concerned about health security, very weird. Well, actually, Jerome Howard is involved with their Center for Humanitarian Health. Is on the Johns Hopkins, is one of the people that works there. And so obviously even though they've been able to paint themselves as independent and this prestigious, health and medical school and all of that, they have a lot of very spooky connections. As I mentioned earlier, after Tara O'Toole left her post as director of this Johns Hopkins Center, she went to work for the CIA, right? So there's definitely a lot of bleeding in, I guess, between this Johns Hopkins Center and these other groups, right? Also interesting about Event 201 is that Johnson & Johnson was participating. And of course, they have now been fast-tracked for a coronavirus vaccine. And they just got backing, I believe, from BARDA, which is this, I forget exactly what BARDA stands for right now, sorry. But it's basically, it's overseen by Robert Cadlick. So whoever, he decides what BARDA puts their money into. They were created, BARDA was created as part of this Bush era policy about biodefense that Cadlick was behind anyway. So now he's leading that aspect of the agency of HHS that oversees BARDA. And so he had BARDA team up with Johnson & Johnson. So, and then, as I mentioned, the Jerome Howard Company is developing these two other vaccines and the plasma treatment. And then the other remaining companies, Moderna and Inovio Pharmaceuticals, are both strategic partners of DARPA. And during Robert Cadlick's time in this position at HHS, he has created all of these partnerships between HHS and DARPA, which I think is really significant because, as I mentioned earlier, he used to lobby on behalf of DARPA and has been involved in a lot of shady stuff over the course of his career. So there is definitely overlap, but the main overlap in the Venn diagram you mentioned, it would be Thomas Inglesby and Tara O'Toole. in terms of Event 201 and Dark Winter. And before Event 201, people haven't looked at this event enough, I think. There was another pandemic simulation that was led by O'Toole, and Inglesby was also there, and it was called Clade X. And this took place, it took place in 2018 and involved people like Tom Daschle, who had gotten an anthrax letter, and some other interesting characters that I think deserve attention, including another Dark Winter participant whose name is Margaret Hamburg, who was involved in Dark Winter and then became part of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a Ted Turner created organization. Right. And now she started off at Dark Winter, then went to that Ted Turner place, became FDA commissioner under Obama, and now she's a main scientific advisor to the Bill Gates Foundation. So that's the connection between Dark Winter and the Bill Gates Foundation. So it's all like this very small clique. And what's really crazy about people like Tom Daschle is that he actually joined this committee that now I think is called the Bipartisan Biodefense Committee or something like that. It's changed names a couple of times, but it was founded by Robert Adlick, and he handpicked the Joe Lieberman, who tried to blame the anthrax attacks on Iraq and Osama bin Laden, and Tom Ridge, who was like the first head of Homeland Security under Bush, to lead that. And Tom Daschle is one of the main people in that organization, and so they were participating in this Clade X exercise. So it's all the same players together, really behind the scenes, orchestrating biodefense policy and all these simulations, and now are very involved in the response and the solutions to this pandemic crisis as it's unfolding, very problem, reaction, solution. I mean, it's a textbook example.
Yeah. There seems to be a theme running through both the anthrax event and the Event 201, which is just faulty equipment that seems to turn out. In the anthrax, you have the basis, the faulty anthrax detectors, and now currently we have not enough COVID-19 tests, and the ones that we've got are malfunctioning. How convenient that they always have these sort of detection devices that seem to just fail right when you need them to work the most.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up basis, because it wasn't just that like, oh no, we started using it in a crisis and it failed. What happened with basis is that it failed, and then Bush was like, let's install this in 30 cities around the country. So, I mean, okay, apparently like the false positives that system detected were awesome for the Bush administration. And that sort of seems to be the case with some of these coronavirus tests that we're seeing now, that the CDC, there was a lot of controversy in the US about the CDC not using this German-made test that was backed by the World Health Organization and said they had to make their own. And actually the CDC sent out this test to various states, and a couple of those states decided to test, to verify and see how that test held up. And they found a disturbingly high rate of false positives. And then they informed the CDC, and the CDC says, our bad, we'll fix the test. I don't know if there were any follow-ups on the subsequent test, but it's very interesting that, if those independent states hadn't complained or done any sort of follow-up on those tests, that would have been the standard nationwide. And there's a lot of, as I said, similarities between this group that was, involved in the anthrax attacks and that basis of false positive system during the anthrax attacks. And now, so it's definitely worth scrutinizing. But
it seems like they want faulty results. It seems like they want to spread panic and fear. They want these detectors going off, or they want COVID-19 tests to skew one way or the other. It seems like the goal of this is to not prevent panic, but to create panic. Obviously, if George W. Bush is installing these, and didn't they even install them in the White House? One of the basis detectors. You're like, so it works so poorly, let's roll it out nationwide, unless, in fact, it actually is working exactly as it was designed. It's designed to show that everything is testing positive for anthrax all over the place all the time, and therefore we have to ramp up our level of panic and fear.
Right. Well, basis, before it was even installed at the White House, the Livermore National Laboratory, which developed it, said in their report about the product that it actually induces the panic and fear it's designed to protect against. That's what they said about it. And so they were like, let's install it in the White House. And that was being developed literally at the same time that Dark Winter was taking place. Another odd coincidence, I guess you could say.
So I'm wondering, why is it that, like, as an Event 201 as an example, why did they make it public? Why wouldn't they try to keep that under wraps? It seems like something that if I was involved in this, and I think we get the idea that they're up to no good. We don't know for sure, but a lot of these simulations tend to play out exactly as they were simulated. So why do you think it is that they didn't try to hide this instead of like publicizing it and filming it? And I remember it was in the news back in October. So it wasn't like it was something that was run, in some deep bunker somewhere. It was out in the open with video cameras. Why?
Well, I think it's the strategy of, the groups that do this sort of stuff. Not just, for like 9/11 or what's going on now or really like anything historically, but they just hide in plain sight, and that sort of gives them an alibi. They justify, oh, this is just normal preparedness. I mean, with scrutiny that's been given to Event 201 since this pandemic has spread around, those same sorts of excuses we've been hearing. Oh, this is just what they do anyway. I mean, of course we have to prepare for a pandemic. Are you against pandemic preparedness? If we hadn't done that event, it would be even worse, the response than it is now, stuff like that. You get those same talking points that help sort of shield them, because if it was done behind closed doors in a way that was hidden from the public and then came out, it would look a lot more suspect than it does if it's done in plain sight, right? So I think it's sort of a strategy, and also speaks as well to the arrogance of these people. They like to sort of rub it in your face a little bit, especially the people that are sort of awake through their games and manipulations and stuff, because they know that at least historically anyway, most people won't buy it, or they'll be dismissive, or mass media will never report on it. So the people that rely only on mass media will never know, things of that nature. I think it's just sort of been their strategy for a long time, even in cases where it's really obvious that there was fuckery afoot, if you will.
There's plenty of that going on here, and one of the things that you pointed out in the when talking about Dark Winter was the Insurrection Act, and is that something that we are living through now currently? I mean, to talk about what that entails and what they were proposing back then, and how that parallels kind of what we're seeing currently.
Right. So in Dark Winter, they were proposing because Dark Winter was a simulation that sort of simulated a National Security Council meeting. And so there was a guy that was playing the role of president. There was a guy playing the role of CIA director. There was a guy playing the role of a Secretary of State and what have you. Right. So a national security advisor. So what was involved there is that there were all these different scenarios that the president and these high level guys that were role playing being high level could choose from. And so in terms of quelling civil unrest, there were all these options for martial law, essentially. And they, talked about the Insurrection Act directly in the script, about using the National Guard to use law enforcement functions, which ostensibly is illegal in the U.S. because of the Posse Comitatus Act. But through the Insurrection Act, through like a presidential decree, he can give governors permission, essentially, to have the National Guard perform law enforcement duties. But since, and there's a couple other acts that come up in relation to options for martial rule that are explored in Dark Winter, because remember, this took place in 2001. Since then, through the various pandemic scares that have gone on since then, bird flu, Ebola, and whatnot, legislation has been pushed through, not just on the federal level, but the state level, that has sort of given this type of created more options, I guess, for these same people. And one of those involves, the declaration of medical martial law, which James Corbett of CorbettReport.com has a really in-depth analysis of those, pieces of legislation that have been put through in various states and all since Dark Winter. So obviously what was explored in the Dark Winter simulation in that regard is there are different options on the table today, arguably, that are even more disturbing than the ones that Dark Winter explored. Another interesting option and concern that came up with Dark Winter was also seen in Event Q01. We're also seeing it now, big surprise, is concern about online disinformation regarding the vaccine, and this concern about controlling the narrative and about where the disease came from, about the vaccines and the cures, people making quote unquote unverified claims, the need to do like limited internet shutdowns, control social media, all of this popped up in these previous simulations. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. It also, Dark Winter also talked about indefinitely detaining civilians that are suspected of harboring the disease. I think is very interesting, considering that now William Barr of the Department of Justice, which is just so absurd that anyone thinks that he's going to drain the swamp, because, oh my gosh, if there's anyone that epitomizes the swamp, it's William Barr. But anyway, he recently asked, under, the excuse of coronavirus, to have powers to indefinitely detain Americans. And of course, as I reported last year, pretty much no one else reported on this story, except for the Huffington Post, which praised it, is that William Barr created a pre-crime program that he announced last October, unfortunately on my birthday. How depressing. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know. So he created this pre-crime program that's called DEEP, the Disruption and Early Engagement Program. At the time, it was justified stopping mass shooters. Of course, now it can be justified as essentially anything, because you can be accused of threatening public safety if you don't, drink the Kool-Aid on, this claim or that claim that's being circulated right now, So there's definitely a lot of concern there. But that type of behavior pops up in Dark Winter. And then Dark Winter even posits that the Department of Justice and police and the FBI will arrest people who did not actually have the disease and will put them in detainment camps and all this stuff, and that they would target mostly poor people and ethnic minorities. Weird that would pop up in this exercise. But, here we are.
Yeah, the James Corbett medical martial law video is great. Actually, he took a clip from a conversation that I had with him and put it in that video towards the end, and we were speculating. The clip he used was something that he said, I don't even really want to go here with it, but I will, because I'm assuming they've thought about this anyway. And his thesis was, what if they roll out this martial law and then, the medical martial law, and then they remove it after a couple of weeks and say, go back to normal. Everything's fine. We've sorted this out. Therefore, we would then go about our lives feeling like, okay, well, we had martial law and it really wasn't all that bad. So the next time they want to bring it back up, they just say, we've got another outbreak and it's back into your houses again. And everybody voluntarily walks in. And he says, what if that's the setup for it being, even more severe the next time around? And unfortunately, I think he might be onto something there. It seems like this.
I think so.
Incremental step towards medical martial law. And if you think about it, it's the most devious form of martial law, because you're voluntarily walking into your own prison cell.
Right. Well, I think they've already set up the narrative a little bit with coronavirus. It is going to, at least here in Chile, what they're saying on the state TV here, is that it's going to be a seasonal thing. It's going to pop up every season, that there's going to continually be outbreaks. And if anyone's really been following, even the mainstream scientific analysis of what is the end result of these lockdowns, national lockdowns and quarantines, it's that there's after people get out of quarantine, there's going to be another wave. I mean, this is pretty much admitted by a lot of these scientists that are even mainstream scientists that agree with the official narrative about its deadliness and how transmissible it is and all the stuff. They say, actually quarantines aren't that effective, because once the quarantine ends, another outbreak happens a few weeks later. So I think that is definitely very plausible that, they'll have it, the management won't be as dire as people predicted, but then it will get progressively more dire and be incremental. I think that was probably a very likely strategy. I mean, James Corbett is so on it and has been so on it for years that I definitely think he is likely onto something, as he has been, like numerous times, pretty much every time about everything. So I'm trying not to fangirl too much, but it's true.
We were both speakers at Anarchapulco in February, and I got a chance to meet him a little bit, and I said, "Hey, would you come on the show?" And he said, "Yeah, of course." And we had much like when I connected with you, my intention with James was to talk about the media, the role of the mainstream media in destroying this planet. And then it immediately shifted to medical martial law, because it was like the day before one of his videos came out. And then he's like, I'm actually working on a bigger one. I said, great, let's talk about that. Same thing with you. Like, hey, let's talk about Epstein. Never mind. Let's talk about Dark Web. You know what might actually wind up happening? And you probably have thought about this, is your worlds, your stories are all going to wind up merging into one, because you've got Epstein and his connections. They've got a lot of overlap with some of these psychopaths. You've got Bill Gates for sure, and your NewsGuard article too, because that we're talking about controlling the flow of information. And once you see these guys on the advisory board and the board of directors of NewsGuard, it's like it's the worst people in the world, the last people in the world on your advisory board. If you were putting together a company that was actually interested in making sure.
I know they put Richard Stengel on there, who was the guy that says like propaganda is actually awesome, guys. Oh, it's so crazy that they would think that would be like cool to have him on there.
I just wrote an article for Activist Post called Propaganda Made in the USA, and I started it with that quote from Richard Stengel on the Council on Foreign Relations panel, where he's saying, I was in the Obama administration, they jokingly called me the chief propagandist. That shouldn't be the guy in charge of the news. I'm sorry. and Michael Hayden? Was Satan not available? I mean, my God, what is going on? So
that's another guy at the Chertoff group with Jerome Hauer and Michael Chertoff is Michael Hayden, also a principal at Chertoff group.
Yeah,
they're all interconnected. So, I mean, probably they will merge at some point. It's really a small group of players that are behind all this crap. So it's kind of inevitable.
One thing that you mentioned before, and I was interested about this because I keep hearing the name Johns Hopkins, the hospital. And I know it's not just the hospital, but it's branches of it or divisions of it or whatever. This strikes me as a deep state asset. What is going on? What is the role of Johns Hopkins in all of this? They don't appear to me to be some sort of independent research hospital. They seem to have some sort of agenda. Are they? Who funds them? Who are these people?
Right. So historically, with universities in the U.S., there's a lot of universities that have a lot of ties to either like DARPA or the Department of Defense, just because of like funding of research studies or intelligence. Because a lot of these, research agencies, whether it's IARPA, DARPA, or HSARPA, which is Homeland Security's research project agency and all of that, a lot of times they outsource a lot of their research and studies to universities and university teams that depend a lot on public funding, whether it's from these agencies or the National Institutes of Health or things like that. They depend on, national public grants for a lot of their funding. So, and not just that, but, historically, the CIA, too, has had a lot of close ties with different universities. Also, even like oligarchs that fund certain universities that have their own like shady ties, like Leslie Wexner, for example, who I talk about a lot in my Epstein series for obvious reasons, had a lot of ties to Ohio State University, which, of course, it came out from the CIA's own releases, did a lot of experiments for the CIA in the 50s and 60s. Did that stop? I don't really know, because Wexner himself was sort of involved with that CIA Airlines Southern Air Transport and got it moved to Ohio just for him, right? So there's a lot of shady stuff there. So Johns Hopkins, by all appearances, seems to be a university that's just like that has, as I mentioned earlier, the director of their health security center that was involved in Event 201 and all of that, Tara O'Toole, went and became, executive vice president of InQtel, of the CIA, right, which is behind, the seed funding for Google, for Palantir, for a bunch of these really shady tech companies. she's been pushing for increased surveillance for public health and whatever for a really long time. And those organizations have tons of money to dump into research in their black budgets, too, not just their public budgets. So, before she was at NQTEL, and even it wasn't just Johns Hopkins that she was leading. She was also leading the University of Pittsburgh's Biosecurity Center. Tara O'Toole, Thomas Inglesby, and Robert Cadlick are on the advisors to Stanford University's biosecurity program. I would argue that there's a bunch of universities in the U.S. that have these biosecurity programs that are run or, connected to the same group of people. Also, George Washington University, George Mason University have a lot of overlap with their biosecurity, biodefense centers as well. It's really a complex, and academia, not just for, bioweapons and biodefense and all this stuff, but, in a lot of other fields of scientific research and even social sciences, psychology, for example, have fused in a lot of ways and have a lot of this overlap, through funding, through money, and in other connections too, being assets for intelligence agencies and whatnot. I mean, that sort of stuff just is a reality with a lot of universities in the U.S. It's unfortunate, and a lot of times it's overlooked, but I mean, it's documented fact at this point that it's happened in the past and continues to happen today. We also know this is also the case for universities, journalism schools, that there's a lot of, the CIA in the 1980s was involved in the rewriting of journalism curriculums for several top journalism schools in the U.S., right? So, this is kind of a far-reaching, there's a lot of far-reaching overlap between academia and intelligence in the military and things of that nature. So, Johns Hopkins, I would say, is just one of many, but I think they're playing a really critical role here with this pandemic as it's folding, in part because Johns Hopkins, whether it's been created by, I think part of it has to do with mainstream media as well, because it's always been sort of held up as this prestigious medical center in the American public consciousness. They seem to be independent. Oh, they're this prestigious university. So people assume they're not associated with maybe the Bill Gates Foundation, even though they do have some overlap, where they're not associated with the government when they actually are, as I pointed out, right? So I think it's just sort of trying to make it look like all these different actors that were involved in Event 201, for example, aren't connected, and that they're all from different sectors of society coming together and uniting to help people when really they're all part of the same swamp, I guess you could say, right? So I think it's just more for public perception, especially when you have Johns Hopkins Medical School and the Johns Hopkins University being a key source for the media about fatality rates for coronavirus, the number of cases. They have a counter that a lot of people are relying on for statistics related to coronavirus, but are sort of, looking at those numbers as independent because, it's Johns Hopkins Medical School, but they're not really taking into account all of what I just sort of mentioned, right? So I think there's definitely some other things going on there as well. But let's also remember, too, a lot of people haven't noticed this, but I think it's kind of humorous in a way, but also very telling about what we've been discussing. The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security did Event 201, is led by Thomas Inglesby, blah, blah, blah. They also did an index about the countries that are best prepared for a pandemic last year. And the countries that were number 1 and 2 were the U.S. and the United Kingdom. So obviously, based on how that's played out now, at least in terms of, if you want to believe the response was the result of incompetence or whatever, that's not what ended up happening. It may have led to a false sense of security among some officials in both of those countries that we're fine if a pandemic hits while other people had other plans. There's different ways to interpret it, but it's interesting that that same source involved Event 201 was really hyping the level of preparedness that these two countries had, even though the simulation they were involved in, Event 201 as well as Crimson Contagion last year in the U.S.'s case, revealed that in fact they were not prepared and that millions of people were going to die for those simulations. Wow. So quite interesting.
That's crazy. Well, tease us a little bit on part 2 and part 3 that's coming out.
Well, I sort of talked about part 2 a little bit. It's about Jerome Hauer and this company that I won't name yet. It'll be in part 2, but it's had a couple of name changes over the past few decades. They've been involved in a lot of corruption, just really mind-boggling the amount of corruption. But what's interesting about them, and I tease this in my article in the introduction in part 2, in the 1990s, they were the sole source of the only government-approved anthrax vaccine in the U.S., right? And a series of scandals. They asked for bailouts. Their facility became unlicensed because it was unsanitary and things like that. All of these scandals started to lead Congress and the Pentagon, which had, been spending millions of dollars buying useless anthrax vaccines they legally couldn't even inject into people for years. Even they started saying, we need to dump this company. And the month and year they started publicly saying we have to dump this company, August 2001, right before September 2001. So again, it's another series of coincidences. This company was about to be dumped and basically go under because this was their main product, this anthrax vaccine that they had a monopoly on, essentially, and had the Pentagon beholden to them for their anthrax vaccination policy, which, by the way, that vaccine disabled numerous people in the U.S. military for life. And was a very controversial vaccine for a number of reasons, not the least of which being the fact that the facility where it was being produced was unsanitary and unlicensed. So obviously, maybe some of those ill effects that these people in the military suffered from the vaccine could obviously have been related to that, but no investigations went on, and the Pentagon insisted for years that we had to keep giving this company money because of national security concerns, whatever that means. But anyway, after September 2001 and the anthrax attacks and all of that, this company had a business boom, essentially, because the U.S. government was ordering more anthrax vaccines. They got their license back like that, thanks to Jerome Howard, who was then advising HHS, and also current Secretary of HHS, Alex Azar, who was general counsel to HHS during this time and was involved in getting this company relicensed. A lot of the same players, like I said earlier, we're seeing today involved in this fiasco, even though the issues of the facility weren't fixed. They got their license back and all this other stuff, and they got millions of dollars, but that wasn't enough for this company. They kept demanding essentially more money and more contracts after the anthrax attacks, arguing, you don't need to contract us just for vaccines for the military. You need to contract us for vaccines for civilians and the police and firefighters and postal workers. And all of these people really milking it. And then they get those contracts and they say, oh, you have to bail us out. And then Pentagon auditors, people that audit this company, would find that they lost the money or spent it on bonuses for senior management and all of this stuff. Anyway, this is the same company that I'll be showing in part 2, involved in similar fiascos for Ebola, for Zika, the opioid crisis that I talked about earlier, and now coronavirus. And we're giving them a bunch of money to develop coronavirus cures, the same shady company. And Jerome Howard's been there pulling the strings with them since, 2001. And the guy that created this company, who has been intimately involved in it, is a guy that was born in Germany that used to work for Booz Allen Hamilton and was involved in the privatization of parts of Porton Downs, the UK's bioweapons lab, and a lot of really other shady characters that I'll be weaving throughout there. And then part 3, as I sort of mentioned earlier, is going to be Robert Kadlec and the Crimson Contagion simulation, because a lot of I've seen some reports talk about how Crimson Contagion existed, but they haven't really delved into what that simulation entailed, because it wasn't just one simulation. As I said earlier, it was 4. It involved multiple states, 12 states. I mean, it was just huge. And the stuff they identified, I think, is very significant, as well as the main players that were involved. It involved the intelligence community. It involved agencies that you wouldn't think would need to be involved in a pandemic response. At 19 federal agencies, I mean, that's a lot. And that's not counting like sub-agencies of those like bigger agencies that were involved. It was almost the entire government. The National Security Council, very involved. They had a specific section in Crimson Contagion that I'll be talking about in part 3 that was called Continuity of Government, which I think is really significant. I wrote a report about continuity of government. We've seen it sort of creep back into the mainstream, where they're talking about the military openly preparing for COG, continuity of government planning. And Newsweek has framed it as, oh, this is something the military just recently came up with. And then later down in the article, they admit that it's not, and that it's been around since World War II, basically. And they talk about how it's developed. They don't even mention the Ronald Reagan administration or Oliver North or Dick Cheney or Rumsfeld or Rex 84 or any of that stuff. They just totally leave that out. And then they're like, Obama did some stuff on it, and they don't describe what he did. Basically expanded it even more. And gave, Trump, who's ostensibly, so evil, they gave him the whole playbook for a dictator in the time of COG, if that ever goes live. So, just the bipartisan, the two-party illusion, again at work, basically. But it's really significant that Crimson Contagion had an entire day, and their last exercise, which was their biggest, it was last August, they devoted an entire day to continuity of government discussions. And they also had an entire day involving finance and the Treasury. The Department of Treasury, led by Steve Mnuchin, was involved in this, which is very interesting. The details of those specific days were not released. I really hope someone gets their hands on what was discussed there. I have a feeling that the day on finance involving Steve Mnuchin and the Secretary of the Treasury might have had some connection to this stimulus bill that recently got rammed through. And was all about giving trillions of dollars to BlackRock to throw around until Larry Fink, but we'll see. That's my suspicion. But it's interesting that the focus of that exercise involved those specific topics, I guess you could say, and that hasn't been discussed very much in media. So anyway, part 3 is going to be an analysis of that and Robert Kadlec's history, how he fits into this whole, what I call sort of the biodefense industrial complex. I guess it's sort of like government and the pharmaceutical companies and the military and these pharmaceutical companies. A lot of people don't really realize that a lot of big players in U.S. defense and the Pentagon have had a lot of historic, deep historic ties to pharmaceutical companies. I mean, if you just look at Donald Rumsfeld, for example, who served as Secretary of Defense twice under Ford and then again under Bush. When he wasn't Secretary of Defense, he was head of J.D. Searle & Co., which is a pharmaceutical company that got sold to Monsanto. And then he was also involved in Gilead, which is another biopharmaceutical company. He was added to their board in the late 80s, and he continued, and then he became chairman in the late 90s and served as, their chairman right up until he became Secretary of Defense for Bush. And there's a lot of other overlaps like that, so I think it's pretty, it's definitely something that people should take into consider when you're looking at the pharmaceutical companies. It's not just that these pharmaceutical companies, share conflicts of interest with the healthcare, the for-profit healthcare industry and insurance providers and all that stuff. It's not just between them and nothing else. There's also ties with the military and intelligence. I mean, it's all sort of, there's all these, all the tentacles are there,
Yeah. Yes, I do. As somebody that wrote a book about an octopus, I'm familiar with the tentacles
right.
that are out there. Donald Rumsfeld being most definitely part of one of them. In fact, I use a clip in the intro to this show from him talking about we cannot account for $2.3 trillion. That was obviously that was said the day before 9/11. Funny how he has such good timing with it, whether it becomes getting aspartame passed through with his ties to Searle, or whether he just happens to be in the right place at the right time with Gilead. He's a swamp creature of epic proportions. And this is really interesting. What you've done is amazing. I'm looking forward to part 2 and 3. I'm curious how that'll turn out. One thing I already know for sure that I don't need to even read your articles to know without a shadow of a doubt is that we are currently being run by criminals. That is a fact. I don't think anybody will debate that in this. And if people want to follow your work, they can check you out at unlimitedhangout.com. They can also find you at The Last American Vagabond, and they can support your Patreon. You're also on Twitter. You're a savage on Twitter. I love your work.
Thanks.
And I'll make sure that all of your links are in the description below. But we're super excited to catch part 2 and part 3, and who knows? Maybe you'll turn this into a book. It certainly is worthy of one.
Yeah, I've already had people mention a book about this, but I honestly, I have one book I have to do on Epstein. I got an offer for a book on Epstein in the larger context of Israeli intelligence espionage against the United States, and now I'm getting offers for this one. So hopefully I'll have time to do all of that, but just I'm going to have to do one book at a time and this series for now. But thanks, I really appreciate that, and hopefully this gets the this my work on this and other people's work on this gets the attention and gets distributed as I think it deserves. What we're seeing right now too with social media and all of that, and we sort of talked about a little bit earlier how these simulations sort of called for this censorship online. Deplatforming, I'm sure, will be imminent at some point. So, it's really important now, especially while we're all sort of, locked up, I guess you could say, to work on getting this information out to as many people as possible. Why that platform is still available. Conveniently, it's still there for now.
And if you're somebody that has more money than time, support Whitney's work through Patreon. If you have more time than money, then support her work by sharing it with everybody that you can. Thanks to everybody for checking this out. Thanks, Whitney, for giving us an hour or so of your time. We certainly do appreciate it.
Thank you.